Hi everyone, this is Becca Hunt from the Children's Safety Network. Welcome to today's webinar, Vulnerability and Victimization, Populations at Increased Risk for Bullying. This is the third in a series of webinars on the issue of bullying awareness, response, and prevention that the Children's Safety Network will be hosting. The series is based on the Building Capacity to Reduce Bullying and its Impact on Youth Across the Lifecourse workshop, which was convened by the Institute of Medicine and National Research Council in April of 2014. This webinar series is produced in conjunction with HRSA and also features a series of blogs that will appear on the stopbullying.gov website. To read those blogs, please visit www.stopbullying.gov/blog. To get things started today, I'd like to pass it over to my colleague Rebecca Wilmer, who will talk about the technology.
Thanks, Becca. So there are two options to hear today's audio. You can either listen through your computer speakers or call into our phone line at 866-835-7973. If you're listening on the phone, please mute your computer speakers to eliminate echo. Phone lines will be muted during the presentation to eliminate any background noise. If you have any questions or technical issues at any time, you can enter them into the Q&A box on the left. After the presentation, we will pause for the presenters to answer your questions. We also have several links available today on the left. To visit a web page, you can click on its name and then select the Browse To button. This webinar will be recorded and archived and sent out to all registrants after the session.
Thank you, Rebecca. Now on to introduction of our presenters. We have two presenters for you today. The first is Jaana Juvonen, and she is a professor in the Developmental Psychology program at UCLA. Her area of expertise is in young adolescent peer relationships, specifically bullying, and school adjustment. She publishes mainly in developmental journals and has co-edited and co-written books including Peer Harassment in School, The Plight of the Vulnerable and Victimized, and Focus on the Wonder Years, Challenges Facing American Middle School. She is a former recipient of the National Academy of Education Spencer Fellowship, Senior Fellowship of the Academy of Finland, and the UCLA Psychology Department Distinguished Adjunct Faculty Teaching Award. Her research on bullying and middle school has been cited in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Atlantic Monthly, Christian Science Monitor, and the Time magazine. She appeared in a PBS series called This Emotional Life, and most recently on CCTV Full Frame on cyberbullying. Our second presenter, Dr. Robert Ferris, is an associate professor of sociology at the University of California at Davis. He studies how adolescent social networks influence and are influenced by risk behaviors like school bullying, dating violence, substance abuse, and delinquency. His research shows how prominence in school social networks can increase the likelihood of both aggression and victimization, that aggressors can boost their social status by attacking rivals, depending on target characteristics, and that teens whose friends care deeply about being popular can be drawn into aggressive behavior even if they do not seek popularity themselves. His publications have received widespread national and international media attention, including an Emmy-winning CNN special report on bullying. I'd like to pass things over now to Dr. Juvonen.
Thank you, Becca, and welcome everybody. We all know that being bullied hurts, and being bullied is most typically associated with anxiety and depression, various kinds of somatic problems such as headaches and stomach aches, and often disengagement in school. Students who get bullied, for example, may be reluctant to raise their hand in class, maybe even reluctant to go to school. And sometimes also these youth are increasingly irritable and show lack of interest in joining various kinds of social events, trying to avoid situations where they may get bullied again. So these kind of symptoms often not only go unnoticed by adults, but also are often misattributed. Because if you look at the list, what does that tell you? That list happens to be very similar to the kinds of characteristics or stereotypes that we have about teenagers. So especially when we think about young teens, it is indeed easy to miss the signs of kids getting bullied. Now, the goal of my presentation today is to look at or try to understand how these kind of silent symptoms, internalizing symptoms, when they are particularly heightened, when the targets feel especially bad. And I'm going to focus on two specific issues here today. One is looking at the larger social environment in which bullying takes place, and the second, looking at the beliefs of the bullied, specifically why they think they are targeted. And I think that each of these two issues will help us think about what the youth who get bullied repeatedly, what kind of interventions they need. So I have a set of poll questions for you. So just to get you oriented to these issues. So I would like you to respond to the 4 questions I presented. So for each of them, they are true or false. Okay, I'm going to wait a little bit longer. Okay, I have a few more seconds. 3, 2, 1. So thank you. I'm going to come back to these issues now as a function of this presentation. So when we try to understand when bullying hurts most, I think that most of us probably think first about the type of bullying. That maybe it is the physical kind that is particularly hurtful, or maybe it's the social exclusion, name calling, or maybe cyberbullying is the one that hurts the most. And there are a good number of studies on looking at comparing the different types of bullying. However, the findings are rather inconsistent. And when you really think about it, across different groups of youth, it may not be that surprising that the findings are inconsistent because, again, what's most hurtful for a 9-year-old boy is probably very different than what is most hurtful for a 14-year-old girl. So, in fact, what I would encourage you to think about is that we can think about these issues from the perspective of the bully. The bully's goal, again, this behavior is very intentional. It is meant to hurt the target, so the bullies are likely to know exactly how to best hurt their victims. Moreover, most victimized youth, they get bullied multiple ways. So it is very hard to say which kind is the worst. But what I think is really important for us to think about is that some of these forms go indeed undetected. It's very difficult for us as parents, as educators, as people who work with youth to see and realize that bullying is really going on. So instead of thinking about what type hurts the most, I think that one way to understand why it's so very distressing at times to get bullied, or it's when it's particularly distressful to get bullied, is when we think about the larger social context or the situations in which bullying takes place. That is, these are not private interactions between a bully and the target, but we know that the bullied are often also very rejected by their peers, for example, by their classmates. That is, they avoid the targeted. The bullied often lack friends and social support, and they are considered very uncool. And let me show you some findings. So this was from one of our first UCLA findings, and it sort of depicts the relative coolness of bullies and victims. The middle line here depicts the sample average or mean of 2,000 students, and the uninvolved students, not surprisingly, are sort of, right there in the middle in terms of coolness. But what is obviously the most striking thing about these data is that whereas the bullies are really cool, the targets are uncool. That is, the power imbalance that defines bullying. We think about bullying as an imbalance of power. That is reflected in the relative social status of bullies and victims. So obviously, the targets are having problems other than being bullied. Now, another status indicator, important one, is peer rejection. That is, who do kids dislike or want to avoid? And here I have some data showing the correlation between being the bully and getting rejected across grade levels. And as you can see, in elementary school at 3rd grade, there's a strong correlation between these two, getting nominated as a bully and being one who everybody says they want to avoid or they dislike. But by 8th grade, there is no association any longer. Now, in contrast, we get the opposite grade-related change for being the victimized, the targeted one. That is, the bullies are more likely to get rejected in later grades rather than the earlier grades. And if you think about now this 8th grade, that is typically the last grade level of middle school, and combined with the previous slide, that bullies are getting cool at least by this time. So it really gives us a sense of the school culture. The school culture is sort of clearly pro-bully, and maybe indeed that the targeted are despised and avoided by others. Another way to think about this is where we get really concrete evidence about how the social context and the reactions of others make a big difference for those who are targeted, is when we look at the bystanders, the other kids, how they respond to bullying behaviors. And so in this particular study, you can see the association, the correlation between social anxiety and victimization as a function of how much there is reinforcement for the bullying behavior. And the topmost line indicates that there's a strong correlation between victimization and social anxiety in settings where the bullying is reinforced by peers. That is, the peers are standing by, maybe smiling, being entertained by this bullying, and when it's also very easy for them to join in bullying. And it is in those kind of circumstances where the bullied are most likely to feel socially anxious, as opposed to the lowest line here, which suggests that in environments where bullying behaviors are not getting reinforced, there is no association between victimization and social anxiety, possibly because the bullied feel more supported. So all of this is to say that the social context or the social situations, how other kids are responding to bullying behaviors, and whether they are doing anything in terms of those who are targeted matters. Now, what might then alleviate the distress of the bullied? So thank goodness there are some good news here. That is, we know that friendships help, and in fact, it's just one friend that can protect against emotional distress. So clearly the bystanders' compassion matters, and it is vital that they feel that it is their business to try to help and intervene somehow. And clearly this is something that we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about how to help the bullied. That is, to think about the interventions. Bystander awareness is a big part of effective interventions, and we can come back to this topic more specifically in our Q&A. So now let me turn to the other aspect that I wanted to highlight. So not only does the social context matter for the bullied, whether other kids are siding with the bully or whether they are showing any support for the bullied, but also what matters is how the bullied come to construe why they get mistreated. That is, anytime a kid gets bullied, they're likely to ask, why? Why me? And what we do know is that most victims don't blame the bully, but in fact they blame themselves. And when they come to blame themselves in terms of thinking that it is my fault and there's nothing I can do about it, it's something about me, what we call here characterological self-blame, that's when they are most likely to feel depressed. So what is really amazing is that when we give students these kind of hypothetical scenarios where we ask them to imagine that they just got ridiculed or intimidated by another kid, and when we compare the kids who report having been bullied and those who are uninvolved in bullying situations, the bullied are much more likely to self-blame, even in these hypothetical scenarios. And moreover, if we look at the bullies, they are least likely to blame themselves for getting mistreated. In fact, if anything, they are masterful at blaming others, and that's why they often engage in aggression. So we also know that, as I alluded to earlier, that when we think about the self-blame of the bullied, we really can think about it as a sort of a vicious circle in the sense that that when a kid gets repeatedly bullied and they come to blame themselves for their plight, that's when they're most likely to get depressed. And then we also know that kids who are depressed are much more likely to get bullied in the first place. So this now suggests that there may be this very vicious circle that we have to try to intervene with in order to alleviate the distress of the bullied. So now most of you seem to agree with the statement that indeed the distress of the bullied is worse when there are very relatively few kids getting bullied in the school. And in fact, there are a couple of studies showing that very clearly, that in schools where bullying and victimization is relatively low, in those kind of settings, the bullied don't show elevated levels of distress. We recently also showed this for for self-blame, and here you can see on this figure that although all students who are high on victimization, that is, they get bullied frequently, they are also high on this characterological self-blame. At the same time, there's a steeper association between seeing yourself or feeling that you're getting bullied and self-blame, meaning when there are fewer kids getting bullied in the school. So in other words, when you look around and you think you are the only one, you're likely to think about that it's about you and there's nothing that you can do about it, and therefore feel distressed. So the challenges for intervention, I think that it's not enough for us to think about only about the rates of bullying and victimization, which is currently the gold standard for any intervention. So we think about whether the rates are going down, because clearly we still have to worry, even when the rates are low, about how the bullied are feeling and how they're construing why they get bullied. So getting more information about how kids think about why they get bullied is absolutely important. And I'm going to provide you another example of that, which seemed a little counterintuitive, another study of ours where we looked at in multi-ethnic schools the kids who were they had either low number or percentage of same ethnicity peers or high number. That is, either they were part of the numerical minority group or the numerical majority group. And here, as you can see, that when they had relatively high number of similar others in their school, there was actually a stronger association between victimization and social anxiety, again, suggesting that the victims felt worse when they belonged to the numerical majority rather than the minority. And in another study, when we looked at this self-blame, indeed what we found is that when the students belonged to this numerical majority group in their school and they got bullied, they were particularly likely to self-blame. When they belonged to the minority, there was no connection between getting bullied and blaming oneself. Again, this suggests that self-blame is very situationally specific. It's important because it relates to distress. But again, most of the time I think we are concerned about the ethnic minority youth or the numerical minorities in our schools and don't think about the plight of those who belong to the majority. So when you think about these conditions under which self-blame and emotional distress is heightened for the bullied, it's when fewer peers are being bullied and when they belong to the numerical majority. So again, two factors that are easily overlooked. So let me conclude and go back to the polling questions. So you were pretty 50-50 on the first one as an audience, thinking about psychological distress. Actually, 80%, almost 80% of you said that psychological distress varies as a function of the type of bullying. Well, that is actually false. And again, it seems like it's more important to think about the type in terms of certain types go undetected for longer periods of time, and we know that that's when obviously the bullied are going to be suffering more. Number two, it doesn't take a lot of friends to reduce the distress of the target of bullying. Rather, that's where you were about 50-50. It takes just one good friend to buffer the distress of the bullied. Finally, the third, again, I think the majority of you realized that was false. The bullied have psychological problems, not because they blame the bullies, but because they blame themselves. And finally, the last one, almost all of you got it correct. Bullies definitely most distressing in schools with low rates of bullying. So where does all this leave us? So when we think about reducing the negative effects of bullying behavior on the targets, so needless to say, make sure that bullying doesn't go undetected. We have to think about how we can be better informed about these covert forms of bullying that are not so easy to observe. Second, we really have to think about the cultural norms that promote the coolness of bullying, and think about the ways that we can try to reduce it. Third, need to think about the bystanders, that not only are they compassionate and feel for the bullied, but we also teach them how to support the bullied. And finally, you have to make sure that the targets don't blame themselves and therefore feel hopeless. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Juvonen. That was a wonderful presentation. If you do have questions for Dr. Juvonen, please enter them into the Q&A box on the lower left-hand side of the screen. We will respond to as many as we can in the last 10 to 15 minutes of today's webinar. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Robert Ferris.
Hi. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. And I just want to thank you all for having me. This is a real treat. So I'm going to be talking about a slightly different question. I loved Jaana's emphasis on the social context of bullying, and I'm going to be focusing on that as well from a slightly different angle. The sort of primary question I'm interested in talking about today is who bullies whom, and particularly whether the strong attack the weak. And the way I'm going to address that question is by using social network analysis to link aggressors with their victims. And before I get into it, I should go over some basic social networks concepts. Some of the data I'm going to be showing you are going to be dyadic, which means, usually we're looking at data of, for individual people, but in dyadic analyses, we're going to be looking at all the different possible pairs of kids in a school. And these are going to be ordered, and there's going to be a sender and a receiver. So each kid is going to show up in a large number of possible pairs, both as a sender and as a receiver. And then within dyads, I'm going to also pay some attention to the status difference between the sender and the potential receiver. And so usually what we're trying to do is figure out whether there's likely to be a tie between kids who are, say, of similar status or different statuses. And the third and fourth concepts I'll sort of demonstrate visually. Social distance is it's very straightforward. It's sort of the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon game. We're interested in counting the minimum number of links that separate one kid from another. And these links are friendships. So this the node circled in black is 4 links away from the node in red. The other key concept is centrality. This is generally an indicator of connectedness, and it can take different forms. In this case, certain measures of centrality would focus on kids who have a lot of ties, and whose ties or whose friends also have a lot of friends. And so that might be represented by the dense clusters of kids in the circles. Other measures of network centrality focus a little bit more on to what extent kids are bridging different populations. So these kids that are circled here may not have as many ties as the other ones, but they're linking very different parts of the social network. But in no case does social network centrality focus on kids who are kind of at the periphery. So it's going to be an indicator of connectedness, and I'll be focused on that as opposed to kids at the periphery. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think are two different kind of patterns of bullying, or I tend to use the word aggression more often, but the first is normative targeting, and this is a situation where we observe kids who tend to be a little bit on the margins of the social network, harassing other kids who are vulnerable. And this has kind of been the pattern that's emerged from a long line of research that is focused on, has identified a lot of psychosocial maladjustment on the part of kids who engage in bullying, other aggressors, and these are typified by low empathy, problematic home lives, emotional reactivity. And on the other end, you see victims in this literature that they tend to be vulnerable. Sometimes they have delayed pubertal development. They may be physically smaller. They may be gender nonconforming. They may have special needs. They may have differences in their physical appearance, and they may be more likely to be socially rejected or isolated. So this is sort of like the traditional view of bullying. And if that were true, oops, I've gone too far. We would expect to see that both aggressors and victims should primarily fall on the periphery of the school social network. Kids who have, maladjustment are less likely. They tend to have lower social skills, and they should fall on the periphery, and that's the same is true for victims. And so we should see that that aggression should be further marginalizing both aggressors and victims. It should be directed towards kids. Aggressors should be targeting kids who are socially distant from them, and we should see a strong link to psychological and family problems. And so the second pattern of aggression that I observed, actually I'll illustrate this. So what we should see is this: if this is a school, and these are all kids in the school and linked by friendship ties, we should expect to see a pattern like this, where the aggressors are kind of on the margins of the school social network, and they're targeting kids who are even farther, perhaps, on the margins. Okay, so the second pattern I'd like to, or the alternate pattern of aggression I'd like to talk about is instrumental. And the idea here is that it's possible that aggression is also used purposefully in the competition for social status. And if that's true, we should see that aggression should be linked to the desire for status. Some kids really want to be popular, and other kids don't care as much about popularity. It should be positively associated with social network centrality, so we would expect the higher status kids to be engaging in this. But at the same time, we should expect, if it's really instrumental and if it's really being used to climb the social ladder, then as kids get near the top, they should desist to some extent from aggression because there's nowhere else to climb. We should also expect to see it directed more towards high status peers rather than the marginal and vulnerable. And it should be directed towards rivals. So if these kids are using aggression to compete for status, we would expect them to be targeting kids who are their rivals, not kids who are at the margins already and are not a threat. So these are two different possible patterns that we could observe using social network data on aggression. I'm going to sort of briefly go over the data we have. This is a sample of about 4,000 adolescents in grades 8 through 10. They all come from 3 counties in North Carolina. And the data I'll show today are from the fall of 2004, the school year 2004 to 2005. And we have social network data on both friendship and aggression. We also have some data I might allude to a little bit on the type and frequency of aggression. So we can break aggression out by physical attacks, verbal abuse, or what we call indirect aggression, which has to do with spreading rumors, engaging in ostracism. Cyberbullying would also qualify. Okay, so I will show you some data on divergent patterns of victimization that we find in our study. So this relates the indicators of vulnerability to rates of victimization. So on the first, wait, I think I got. I'm not able to use that little arrow thing, but the first 2 columns compare social isolates. So these are kids who have no friends at all, and with other kids who are marginal but not totally isolated. And we see a higher rate of victimization on the part of isolates. So they are targeted more often than kids who are just sort of at the periphery. We also see a pretty sharp difference between kids who have delayed pubertal development. So kids who are a little bit behind in terms of physical development are at greater risk of victimization. Similarly, kids who have are less happy with their appearance, who may have poorer body image, are more likely to be targeted. And then finally, in some other data that are from the school in New York, we find that LGBTQ kids, gender nonconforming kids, are at greater risk of being victimized. So we do find a pretty clear relationship in these cases between characteristics that might make kids vulnerable and their rate of victimization. So we find evidence of that first pattern, of normative targeting. But we also find an interesting pattern, a second pattern, that I think is consistent with instrumental targeting. And this is the relationship between victimization and centrality. And so what you see here is that as centrality increases, we actually see an increase in the rate of victimization. And again, this is with, we observe both patterns. We see that kids are vulnerable, also are getting harassed and picked on. But we also see a second pattern where kids who are relatively high status are also getting targeted, probably, I think, for different reasons. And so I'm going to explore those reasons here. So the idea behind instrumental aggression is that it's motivated by the desire for status, and we see some evidence of that. This is the effect of the importance of popularity on a growth in aggression or escalation of aggressive behavior. And we find that kids who care more about being popular become more aggressive over time. We also find an interesting pattern where regardless of how much they care about being popular, if they have a friendship group if they're in a friendship group that really emphasizes popularity, they're also more likely to be aggressive. So there's kind of at least some indication that this competition for status can embroil kids who may not even want to play that game, but they find themselves kind of stuck in it. Okay, so we find some evidence is motivated by the desire for status. We should also see that it escalates as centrality increases, and that's displayed here. These are the top line is overall rates of aggression, aggressive behavior. The horizontal axis is their social network centrality, and we see that as kids increase their centrality, all three forms of aggressive behavior increase up until a point near the top where they begin to decrease. And I should emphasize that the social network centrality is kind of distributed like income is in America. It's very, very skewed, and there are very, very few kids. The vast majority of kids are below 3 points on that scale. So for most kids, an increase in status is going to be associated with an increase in aggressive behavior, at least in our data. And so we can look at this. This is a network of a school. You can see these dense clusters of kids. These are sort of organized by grades. And this is where I think we can cue a movie. Would you all be able to pull that up? Perfect. And so you're going to see that image of those dense clusters of kids, and we're going to show, hopefully, those friendship ties will fade. And then we're going to see the emergence of aggressive ties. So the kids are staying in the same location. And we're seeing aggressive ties emerging not at the outskirts of the social network, but mostly in the dense core. And the kids who are aggressive, highly aggressive, are sort of looming as larger red nodes. Kids who are targets or frequent targets are larger blue nodes. And but the key message here is that a lot of this is going on within the core of the social network of the school. Okay, we're good with the video. So we can actually observe this relationship with centrality. And so this is a static image for those who weren't able to see the video of what that network looks like. Okay, so we're motivated by the desire for status, and we see that it escalates as centrality increases, and then it declines near the top. And another aspect of this is that we should expect, if aggression is instrumental, that we might expect that it's going to be directed towards rivals. And most of the time, rivals are occurring within the friendship group. They're not across, in the other, side of the school social life. They're mostly close. And that's, first, I'll take a look at demographic characteristics. And so we see that, and this is another way of thinking about social distance, we tend to see that aggressive behavior is concentrated within groups. So we see higher rates of African Americans aggressing towards African Americans than they are towards other people. We see higher rates of whites than we do, we see, in other words, higher rates of within race aggression than across race aggression. We see higher rates of within gender aggression than across gender aggression. The data for sexual orientation is a little, we should be cautious about interpreting it because it's based on a relatively small sample of kids who identify as LGBTQ. But we do see higher rates of, high rates of, straights tend to, this is where we have a little bit of departure, but so we see that straight kids target LGBTQ kids at a relatively high rate, more often than they target other straight kids. But we also see conflict going on within, among kids who identify as LGBTQ. So for the most part, we see aggression staying within these social categories. And we also, if you look at, this is the graph of social distance. So the horizontal axis reflects the number of links apart a pair of kids are in the social network. And so the one means that's the rate of aggression among kids who say they are friends. And we actually see very high rates of aggression among kids who identify as friends. And this predicts subsequent friendship breakups over time. But we see a lot of conflict and aggression emerging among friends, and it declines as kids get farther apart socially. So that's another indicator that there may be instrumental purposes behind this. And sometimes that finding is surprising to people, although I think the concept of frenemies explains it pretty well. But you don't have to look very hard to find narratives about this. And I'm not going to read this, but bullying.org has a wonderful resource of stories that victims and sometimes perpetrators of aggression post online. And they often are talking about how their friends turned on them or facilitate their victimization. So it's really an unfortunate thing. And also, I'm not going to get into this, but we have some evidence that it's not, one might think that it's due to enhanced opportunities. Their friends are hanging out together, and that does not seem to be the case. So the final question of whether the strong attack the weak, our data suggests that by and large they do not. So this is a graph that shows the status of the sender, of a potential sender in a pair, and the potential receiver. And that's the highest rate of aggression is occurring when both kids are relatively high status. So we see the most aggression among high status kids who are socially close to each other. But we also, there's another question about whether the strong attack the weak, and we find evidence that when the sender is higher status than the receiver, we see a higher rate of aggression. So that's indicated by the yellow circle versus the white circle. So by and large, it's more likely that a kid who is higher status will attack a low status kid than vice versa. And that should hardly be surprising. I think I'm going to have to skip over this data for the interest of time. But we will, maybe we can address some of these questions later if there's interest, but I do find that aggressive kids, the high status aggressors tend to attack high status victims. Aggressors who care about popularity also tend to attack higher status victims. And they also tend to go after kids, they're more likely to go after kids who are their friends. So you see that the kids who are attacking or going after high status kids are more likely to be going after their friends. And so I'm going to have to skip some of these, but I'll just skip right ahead to the conclusion. So we find some evidence of both normative targeting and instrumental targeting. of high-status rivals. So vulnerable, there are victims who are vulnerable, and then victims who might surprise you in that they are relatively high status and seem to have a healthy social life. So we see both patterns. In our data, the instrumental pattern seems to be more prevalent. We see a stronger evidence of that than we do the vulnerable victim pattern. But we see that both, high status and status motivated aggressors are more likely to target other high status kids and their own friends. And so that friendship dynamic is more prevalent among the instrumental aggressors. On the flip side, the kids who are targeting vulnerable victims tend to be lower status. They also are more anxious and depressed, and they're less likely to target within their friendship group. Okay, so that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ferris. That was a very insightful presentation. I really appreciated it. As you type your questions into the Q&A box on the lower left-hand side of the screen, I would like to remind you of a number of resources that are available for additional information around bullying and prevention. Those are on the screen in front of you, as well as in the link pod on the left-hand side. We have received a number of questions already. So I'd like to jump right in with a series on bystanders. It seems like several of our audience members had questions about this. So I'm going to give you a couple questions that they have presented and ask you just to comment about bystanders in general with those in mind. So the questions that came in are, what age can bystanders step into this role? Is there an age that's too young for them, or is there a time when they become more effective as bystanders? Also, are bystanders at increased risk for becoming bullies themselves? Are they putting themselves into a role which could lead them to future victimization? And finally, how do you teach someone to be a bystander, to be that one friend, to be an upstander? And does it lie in the teaching of empathy skills? So a lot of food for thought, but Dr. Juvonen, if you'd like to try to address those.
Great. Wonderful questions. Indeed, I think this is part of the key here when we're trying to change the culture of the school, the bystanders. So I'm going to probably address these issues in a slightly different order than the questions came, but essentially when you think about bystander intervention, how to make them feel like it is their business to get involved in proactively, that is not helping the bully but the victim. Number one is awareness training. So just sort of showing kids that they have not realized that how they, by staying there, not doing anything, but being present in the situation, how they are actually promoting bullying behavior, how they are encouraging the one who bullies, and at the same time how that affects the victim. And empathy is key there, so that they really can see themselves that how it would feel like to be in the shoes of the targeted when you get not only bullied, but everybody else is standing around and nobody says anything kind to you or is trying to intervene. So empathy is a key, and awareness training is a must. However, we have to go further than that. So, for example, we've done studies where we show that indeed most bystanders do feel a lot of empathy, but they're not gutsy enough to do anything. And that's understandable. I mean, think about how many times we as adults, we don't get involved in situations where we fear for our own safety. Now, for kids, it may not always be about their safety. It's also about their status. They are protecting their status. They don't want to put that at risk. So it looks like I'm aligning myself with a uncool person. Why would I do that? I want to be considered as cool and popular. So what we have to do is to try to convince them that this could be happening to them, and this is ultimately a question of their rights. That's one of the ways that I've seen schools address it in a very effective way. That is, they have this whole series of exercises about rights of of kids? What are you entitled to when you come to school? What should you not be afraid of or need to be concerned about? And they put safety there, very quickly. And when you really talk about it, it's their right. They feel more empowered than to do something about it. Now, how young you can start doing it, I've seen forms of this kind of curriculum being implemented at pre-K, and it works wonders. In fact, it may be more effective the younger we start, but again, when we talk about human rights, that's a good place also in adolescence to talk about their rights to say fear-free schooling, if you will. And I think that one more thing that I want to mention about the bystanders, how to make them brave enough or safe enough to intervene. One critical feature here is that we also teach them specific skills. And when they get this idea about the imbalance of power, we tell them that, if that's what it's really about, going with a pal to intervene is the way you can shift the power imbalance. That is, when two kids intervene with bullying and say, stop it, that's not okay what you're doing, bullying stops. We know that even if one high-status kid does it, it stops right then and there. It's just that, we don't have enough high-status kids to go and do this to be the sort of police for everybody. But any kid can do it, but then they should find a pal to try to intervene with to do it.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Juvonen. I think that was a very apt response. We've had several questions come in from our audience with concern for the bully. We've learned on this webinar and on previous webinars in this series about how bullies are oftentimes victims themselves of either bullying or other forms of violence. And in addition to that, some of the audience members are acknowledging that sometimes bullies don't recognize their behavior as bullying, especially if it's in that peer-to-peer same network group. Maybe perhaps they're just seeing it as something that's not necessarily a power imbalance or bullying. So how do you address this uncool, make the bully uncool without isolating them, or also recognizing that they might not identify how their behavior is actually bullying?
Who should take that one?
Dr. Ferris, if you'd like to take that one.
Sure. Yeah.
Great.
Sure. Happy to. Yeah. Okay. So that's a complicated. That's sort of the $1,000,000 question. I think. Part of the answer is yes. I mean, absolutely, kids are often kind of reluctant to identify aggression as bullying. And there's some nice insights that are out there about, the language that the kids use is different, and they are more likely to talk about things like drama and, having a beef with somebody, terms like that, rather than, bullying, which puts them in the position of victimization, either victim or perpetrator. And often it seems a little more complicated than that. And I think, and I think it's true that a lot of times, sometimes kids are not aware of how severely, painful their aggressive behavior can be for other kids. But I think by and large, kids who are engaging this, and who are at least are doing it in a way that hurts kids, are skilled enough to know how to hurt them, and so they're also probably skilled enough to know that they are hurting them. So, it can be very subtle. I'm working with some data on, social media and cyberbullying, and just the act of, even if a kid's in a photo, the act of not tagging somebody in the photo is a slight that is interpreted as very intentional, and it sounds like there's evidence to suggest that it is often intentional, and these little tiny things that would be invisible to a lot of adults are intentional and are interpreted in those ways. So I think often kids know what they're doing, and we just need to change the reasons that they're doing it and work on reorienting kids away from competition for status towards, hopefully, ideally, forging stronger, a few strong friends rather than many, Facebook friends.
Thank you, Dr. Ferris. We have a definitional question that I'd like to touch on, which I think will be really quick. We have one participant who says, I'm surprised by the low rate of male targeting females with aggression. Was unwanted sexual touching, groping, sexual harassment addressed as a form of physical aggression in this study?
Yes, so that might appear low, but you have to take into consideration that these, we're asking kids, these are kids in 8th, 9th, and 10th grade, and we're asking kids to identify what they consider to be serious acts of aggression. And so the majority of kids, and not just in our study, but in any study, you'll find it, at least that I've come across, that only the minority of kids are involved in bullying, either as perpetrator or victim. So we're looking at a minority of kids, and because there's so many kids who are uninvolved, and because we're looking at dyads, the likelihood of finding a dyad that's aggressive is actually low, just by chance alone. So I would focus less on the absolute rate of aggression between boys and girls, and more on the relative rate. And one of the things that I think is important in that slide is that you see that the highest rates of aggression between girls, followed by between boys, but boys are more likely to pick on girls than girls are to pick on boys. And so what we find is that boys and girls are equally aggressive, but that they're disproportionately targeting girls. So there is a real important gender imbalance that we observe.
Thank you very much. We've had 2 questions come in about instrumental aggression. One, I think they relate to one another, but one says, Dr. Juvonen discussed distress experienced by victims. Is the hurt less painful in instrumental aggression?
Well, I've explored this question, and I received some sort of surprising results, and I think they need to be interpreted with caution and explored a little more deeply. But what we found, my colleagues and I have found, is that the higher the status of a victim, the more painful and distressing a given incident of aggression will be. And so there's a variety of possible interpretations for this. I think one possibility is that that these are kids who are who've invested perhaps more in their social standing and feel like they have more to lose. They could be less accustomed to aggression, and I think kids who fit that sort of vulnerable profile may be used to. They've probably been harassed since early ages, elementary school maybe. So a new incident of aggression may not be as shocking to them as it would be perhaps to some kid who is not accustomed to it. But what we found is actually that the higher the status, the more consequential, both in terms of their mental health, their attachment to school, and also their position in the social network. So it actually does, on average, have a tendency to cause victims, high-status victims, to lose their high standing.
Great, thank you so much. A number of our audience members, we have just 2 more minutes left, but a number of audience members have asked questions about how parents can help their children become upstanders and bystanders, and what schools can do to help bullying be prevented. And I would like to say that future webinars on this series will start to address that question more and more, so please do keep your eyes peeled for upcoming webinars on these topics. But Dr. Juvonen, do you have any final comments or any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I think that in terms of parents, really they play a very critical part in here. It's like any sensitive issue. If you've never talked to your kid about mistreatment of individuals, whether we're talking about discrimination, bullying, genocides, avoiding these topics, the kids are very unlikely to bring this up when they want to talk about them. So number one is that that in developmentally appropriate ways, I think it's the earlier parents start talking about these issues, and again, there are plenty of opportunities. We witness all kinds of situations of power imbalance and aggression in our everyday lives, whether it is on TV or on the playground. And just sort of talking about, what happened, why do you think it happened, how do you think that made so-and-so feel, what do you think we could do to make them feel better? So these would be the little kid discussions, and they obviously get much more elaborate. The bottom line is start talking as a parent about other kids other than, what would you do with your kid. Similar discussions, obviously, at the school is a good starting point, but there we really need some systematic policies and practices and consistent follow-through.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Juvonen. That is all the time that we have for today. I would like to thank you very much for our great presentations, Dr. Ferris and Dr. Juvonen. There's a brief evaluation on the screen in front of you. If you would take the time to fill that out, that helps us improve our work here. And keep an eye out for additional webinar announcements in this series. Thank you, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.